Okay, for the first video for factoring polynomials, we're going to start with finding the other factor if they've given you one factor. So we have 25a cubed b squared c, and the factor that you're given is 5ac, and you want to find the other factor. So you can think about that as division. Basically divide this by 5ac, it'll give you the other factor. So I'm going to write it as 5ac times something. So if we have a 25 and we're factoring out 5, then we would need a 5 to be able to multiply 5 times 5 to give us 25. Or like I said, you can think about it division. 25 divided by 5 is 5. You have an a cubed, and we have one factor as an a. So if you do division, a cubed divided by a, you take you subtract your exponents. 3 minus to the first power, so 3 minus 1 is 2. So we'd have a squared left. And you can check that a times a squared is a cubed. You have b squared here, and there's no b, so it's just going to stick around, so you just have b squared in there. And then we have a c, but we factored the c out. So if it's part of your factor, then it's just c divided by c, which is 1, so you don't really have it. So if you double check this after you do this, 5 times 5 is 25, a times a squared, where you add the exponents, is a cubed. B squared stays, and then c is there as well. So 5a squared b squared is the other factor. So if you're given a factor, you're just trying to figure out what the other factor is that'll multiply together to give you whatever it is it's given you here. For number 4, we want to do 14a minus 3 to the 6th times a plus 4 squared, and the factor that it gives you is 2, a minus 3 cubed times a plus 4. And this works the same way even if you don't have just an a. If it's a to the 6th versus a minus 3 to the 6th, you still do it the same way. So we have this factor, so we know we have 2 times a minus 3 squared times a plus 4. What we want to know is what do we multiply to this to get 14a minus 3 to the 6 times a plus 4 squared. So again, you can think about it as division, or you can just figure out the multiplication, whichever way you want to think about it. So if I have a 2 and I need to multiply to get 14, I have to multiply 2 by 7. So because 14 divided by 2 is 7, or 2 times 7 is 14. Okay. I have out here an a minus 3 squared. I need a minus 3 to the 6th. So again, if you divide, you subtract the exponents. So 6 minus 2 is 4. Or if you think about it when you're multiplying, you have a minus 3 squared times a minus 3 to the 4th. You'd add the exponents. 2 plus 4 is 6. I have a plus 4 squared, and I've got an a plus 4 here, so I would need one more because I have to have 2 of them. So they're squared, so I'd have to have a plus 4, because a plus 4, if I do a plus 4 times a plus 4, I get a plus 4 squared. Or again, if I divide, 2 minus 1 is to the first power. So this is my other factor. So this is not factoring out the greatest common factor, which is what you normally want to do. This is just giving you a factor, and basically you're dividing or figuring out what to multiply it by to get the other factor. So we'll just do a few more of these, and then we'll move on to the greatest common factor. So we have 20a squared minus 12a, and we want to, one factor is 4a, and you want to figure out the other factor. So 4a times what gives me 20a squared minus 12a. So just take it piece by piece. So to get 4 to be a 20, I need to multiply by 5, because 20 divided by 4 is 5, or like I said, 4 times 5 is 20. I've got a squared, and I have a. I need another one, so I need to do 5a. And again, if you divide 2, and this is to the first power, so 2 minus 1 is to the first power. If you want to think about it that way, that's fine. And then minus is just going to stay. I have 4, I need 12. I'll multiply 4 by 3. I have a. That's all I need, so I don't have to do anything else. And you can check this. So 4 times 5 is 20. A times a is a squared. and then minus, since it's negative, 4 times 3 is 12, and a just goes in there, so minus 12a. So this is my other factor. For number 8, you have 15a to the 5th minus 18a to the 4th plus 24a squared, and the factor it gives you is 3a squared. So what times 3a squared will give me 15a to the 5th minus 18a to the 4th plus 24a squared. So again, to get 3a squared, and I want to multiply it by something to give me 15a to the 5th. You can think about it, division, however you want to do it. 15 divided by 3 is 5. A to the 5th divided by a squared, 5 minus 2 is 3. And you can always check it, 3 times 5 is 15, a squared times a cubed, you add a to the 5th. The minus is just going to go on through, since this is a positive out here, so we just drop down the minus. So 18 divided by 3 is 6. A to the 4th divided by a squared is a squared. 4 minus 2 is 2. And again, you can check it. 3 times 6 is, or 3 times negative 6 is negative 18. A squared times a squared is a to the 4th. Plus 24 divided by 3 is 8. And a squared divided by a squared is just 1. So you're done. And again, you can check it. 3 times 8 is 24. And then the a squared would just be distributed over. So this is my other factor. So sometimes when you are factoring, you need to be able to factor out negatives, and when you factor out negatives, you have to switch all the signs. So if I have x squared minus x plus 1, and I want to factor, the factor it gives me is negative 1, well, that means I have negative 1 times, what happens? You have to switch all these signs, basically. You're basically dividing this whole thing by a negative 1 to get the other factor. But if I have a negative 1 out here and this is positive, to get a positive I have to multiply by a negative. I have a negative here and this is negative, so I'd have to do the opposite. So I'd have to multiply by a positive. And then again here, if this is positive, I've got a negative, so I'd have to multiply by a negative. And you can check that. So basically if you factor out a negative, you have to switch all the signs. So negative 1 times negative x squared is positive x squared. Negative 1 times x is negative x, and negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. So when you are factoring, so this is the other factor, if you factor out a negative 1. So when you are factoring, just make sure that if you factor out a negative, you switch all the signs. Because otherwise you end up with the answer with the wrong signs. Okay, so what we really want to do is to factor out the greatest common factor, which is where you choose, you pick, you have to decide what the greatest common factor is. And usually when you're factoring, the first thing you want to do before you factor it all is determine if it has a greatest common factor, and if it does, factor it out. So that way you can make it easier, because if you factor it out, you have smaller numbers and exponents to work with usually. So I have a times x squared minus a. So you want to figure out, okay, what do these two things have in common, the greatest common factor? So I have ax squared minus a, so they have an a in common, and that is all they have in common. Nothing else is in common. So I'm going to factor out the a. And again, you can think about it as division, or just you're factoring it out, so you have to multiply it back in when you check it, distribute it. So if I have ax squared and I factor the a out, I just have x squared left. And if I have an a and I factor the a out, I have a minus 1 left. Don't leave off the minus 1. If you do, you just have ax squared. You don't have minus a, because now if you distribute it, you have ax squared minus a. So that's correct. Now, if you're only doing the GCF, you can stop here, but just so you can see what the difference of squares is, this is a difference of squares. So x squared minus 1 squared, because 1 squared is 1, so that's a difference of squares. So you could factor that into, it's x minus 1 times x plus 1. So again, if you're only doing the GCF, you could stop here, but just so you can see it, that it's a difference of squares. X minus 1 times x plus 1, and you can check that. Difference of squared says that a squared minus b squared is always, oops, if I could write here, a minus b times a plus b, or a plus b times a minus b, however you want to write it. And you can check that by foiling. You have first, outer, inner, last, so a times a, I'm not going to draw all the arrows because otherwise it'll get too jumped up, but a times a is a squared. You got a times b is plus ab. Negative b times a is minus ab, because multiplication's commutative, doesn't matter what order you write it in. And then minus b times b is minus b squared, and these cancel. So it's a squared minus b squared. So anytime you have a difference of squares, you can factor that way. So again, you could check this. You got x times x is x squared. X times 1 is x, minus 1 times x is minus x, so those are gone. And then negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. So difference of squares, that's the rule, and that's why it works there. If you have negative 4 x squared minus 12x minus 8, and you want to factor out the greatest common factor. So here you have two options you could pick. So you've got negative 4, negative 12, and negative 8. So the biggest number that they all have in common is 4. Or you could do negative 4. I'm going to do positive 4 first, just to show you what the difference is. So if I decide to do 4, and you have an x squared, an x, and no x, so that you can't factor out any variable, you just have to leave it in there. So if I take out a 4, then 4 divided by 4 is 1, so I'm going to have negative x squared, because I've taken out a positive 4, not a negative. Excuse me. I have a 12. If I've factored the 4 out, I've got 3 left, so minus 3x. And if I have an 8, I've factored the 4 out, so I've got a minus 2 left. So that would be one option. Most of you would probably take out the negative, though. So it's kind of an or, but anyways, if you factor out the negative 4, you're going to have the same thing here, except all your signs are going to be now positive, because if you take negative 4 out of negative 4x squared, you're left with just a positive x squared. Negative 12x, I've taken out the negative 4, so I'm left with a positive 3x. Negative 8, I've factored out the negative 4, so I'm left with a positive 2. So this is probably the answer that everybody would give. So like I said, when you factor out negatives, like I mentioned before, just make sure you switch all the signs. For 17, it looks a little funny, but it's to show you the idea of grouping before we get into grouping. So you want to factor out the greatest common factor of this. Well, if this were just xa plus xb, you'd factor out the x, right? So let me write that over here. If that's all it was, you would say, okay, I'm going to factor out x, and I'm going to be left with an a plus b. So you can do the same thing, even though this is 2x plus 7 times a and 2x plus 7 times b, that's fine. Both of these terms have this in common, so you can factor it out. So I've got 2x plus 7. I'm left with an a plus a b. And you can FOIL this, and if you do, you'll get 2xa and yada yada yada, but foiling the other version is to do 2x plus 7 times a, 2x plus 7 times b, which is what it has wrote here. So it's still the same, even if you have something in parentheses like this when you're multiplying, you can still factor it out, just as long as it's the same factor. So when we do grouping, you'll see that more. So for the last one on factoring out the greatest common factor, this one's kind of long. I'm going to try to write it a little bit small so I can fit it all in one line. So you got 8a cubed b to the 15th plus 24a squared b to the 14th plus 48 a cubed b to the 6th minus 20 a cubed b to the 7th plus 80 a to the 4th b to the 6th minus 4a cubed b to the 7th, and finally plus 4a squared b. Okay, so that one's a little bit longer there. So you want to factor out the greatest common factor. So again, you want to look at all your numbers, figure out what's the biggest number they all have in common. For your exponents, I didn't mention this yet, but for your exponents, when you look at them, you always factor out the smallest exponent that they have. So like if they all have a's, that's fine. You take the smallest one. So if it's a cubed, you factor out a cubed. If it's a to the first, you'd factor out a to the first, or whatever. So you always take the smallest exponent of whatever the variable is. So we've got 8, 24, 48, negative 20, 80, negative 4, and 4. So the biggest number that those all have in common is 4. So we're going to have 4. For my a's, they all have a's. I've got a cubed, a squared, a cubed, a cubed, a to the 4th, a cubed, a squared. So the biggest a that they all have in common is an a squared. So you take out the smallest exponent, like I said. And then they all have b's. I got b to the 15th, b to the 14th, b to the 6th, b to the 7th, b to the 6th, b to the 7th, and b. So the one that I can take out is a b. Because you can't take b to the 14th out of a b to the 6th, right? So you have to take out the smallest. So 4a squared b is my greatest common factor. So what does that leave me with? Again, if you think about it as division, that's fine. Or you can just figure out what to multiply to get this, which is basically doing division. But anyway, so I've got 4 out here. I need an 8, so I'm going to do a 2. 8 divided by 4 is 2. I've got a squared. I need a cubed, so I need an a. I've got 1b here, but I need b to the 15th, so I need 14 more. So 2ab to the 14th. And you can check this as you go. So that's 8, a cubed, b to the 15th. Plus 24 divided by 4 is 6. Or what times 4 gives you 24 is 6. You know, however you want to think about it. A squared's already here, and I factored a squared out. And so you don't have to worry about that because a squared divided by a squared is 1. So I'm not going to write anything down. I've got a b here, and I need b to the 14th. So again, if you think about it as division, 14 minus 1 is b to the 13th. And if I check it as I go, 4 times 6 is 24. I've got a squared, and then b to the 14th when I add 13 and 1. Next one, 48 divided by 4 is 12. Got a cubed divided by a squared is a. And b to the 6th divided by b is b to the 5th. I'm just taking those exponents down by 1 for b's. So, and again, if I check it, 4 times 12 is 48. A squared times a is a to the 3rd, and b times b to the 5th is b to the 6th. Next one, I've got negative 20. I've taken out the 4, so I've got a negative 5 in here still. A cubed, I've taken out an a squared, so I've still got 1a left. And b to the 7th, I've taken out b, 1b, so I've still got 6 b's left. Again, if I check it, 4 times negative 5 is negative 20. A squared times a is a cubed, and b times b to the 6th is b to the 7th. For the next one, I've got 80. I've taken out a 4, so I've got 20 left. A to the 4th, I've taken out a squared, so I've still got 2 a's. I've got 2 a's left, so a squared. B to the 6th, I've taken out 1b, so I've got a b to the 5th left. Again, if you distribute it back in, it gives you this. Minus 4, I've taken out a 4, so I've just got a minus 1 left. A cubed, I've taken out an a squared, so I've got an a left. And b to the 7th, I've taken out a b, so I've got a b to the 6th left. Again, if you multiply it back in, 4 times negative 1 here is negative 4, and then a squared times a is a cubed, b times b to the 6th is b to the 7th. Finally, for the last one, 4a squared b is exactly what I have out here, so it is a plus 1. Don't forget this, because when I distribute this back in, I get each term, and if I forget the plus 1, I don't get the last term, so you have to make sure you do the plus 1. So when you're factoring, you always want to look for greatest common factor first, because it might make it a little bit easier to factor. So your next few questions you're going to answer are on factoring out the greatest common factor, and then you'll get into factoring other ways by grouping and so forth.